Hi, Sophie.
Hi, Sin.
Hi, everyone. And welcome to the Snap Covenant episode 294. And today, we're going to talk about Ranni. My runny nose, you say? Give me a break, I'm recovering from COVID. So, Sophie.
Yes.
Before we start, I'd like to mention something. We have already released videos talking about the royal family, the Scarlet Rot, as well as Radagon and Marika.
Yeah.
Those videos explain ways in which characters are related and talk about the world of Elden Ring. Thank you, Enzo. With this lore video, we assume that everyone has already seen our content and we will not necessarily be revisiting lore from our previous videos.
Or they've maybe seen someone else's much better lore videos.
That's the more likely scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. No one watches us.
With that being said, let me tell you a little about Ranni the Witch.
Alright then.
Ranni is the daughter of Rennala and Radagon. She has two brothers, Radahn and Rykard.
Yes.
When we first meet Ranni, she introduces herself as Renna and gives us the spirit calling bell.
Yes.
It's important to note that her soul is housed within a doll which is based on a snow witch that Ranni encountered as a child.
Yes. The doll is not actually what Ranni looks like.
Ranni has 3 people in her service. Blythe the half-wolf, he is her shadow, her blade, and her loyal ally.
Yeah.
War Counselor E.G. He's a blacksmith who once served the Carian royals.
You mean my itchy nose? It's called a callback.
I'll need to add the applause button.
Thank you.
And Preceptor Salivus, a magic preceptor who serves the Carian royals and wears a large hat with the movements of the stars drawn on the inside of the brim.
Yes.
Also, Adula the Glintstone Dragon, a devourer of sorcerers, was bested by Ranni. As for Ranni's long-term goals, she seems to want to establish a new order, an order of stars and moon of the chill night. Now, let's look at the angelic outline.
Seal up those things which the 7 thunders uttered, and write them not.
Because we're gonna do it for you. Hi, I'm the Angelic Outline, and here are the top 7 things the 7 thunders uttered, brought to you by Squarespace. Number 7.
So, Sophie.
Yes.
Can you please tell me about Ranni's childhood?
Alright, so you've helpfully given me some notes about Ranni, and the first note you've got here says, Ranni comes from a line of astrologers. It's not quite that simple. Ranni comes from a family that are themselves descended from astrologers, but they themselves are a kind of separate line that are the Glintstone sorcerers. So the astrologers were people who lived alongside the fire giants in the mountaintops.
Were the astrologers themselves giants?
It's possible, but then they wouldn't have been able to fit inside the buildings they left behind.
Counterpoint. Yorm.
That's true.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The cultists will understand this one, but anybody who's new, just ignore this.
I'm glad all of the Elden Ring things people are searching for are this degree of impenetrable to people who haven't been listening to us since 2018. So, the astrologers lived alongside the giants, along the mountaintops. The astrologers are also sometimes referred to as the stargazers. So in the mountaintops you find the ruins of where the astrologers lived. It's called the Stargazers' Ruins. You find something called the Stargazer Heirloom. You find that on Ranni's body, as in her actual, corporeal flesh rather than the doll.
Like her corpse?
Her corpse, yes. So you find the Stargazer's Heirloom there, and it talks about, Ranni as a child sort of being led into looking at the moon. But going back to the mountaintops give you a very good view of the moon. This is presumably what they mean by stargazers. You get a very good look at the moon from the Stargazer's Ruins. There's also one of the interesting little painting quests. And there is a painting that is just called Sorcerer. And that painting actually leads you to an area that's near the Stargazer's ruins. And when you're there, you see this this sort of spectral man, and as he's disappearing, he says, "This is the moon that Queen Rennala sought," Rennala being Ranni's mother. There's also a building in the mountaintops that is called the Heretical Rise. We will get to that later on. It's going to be important, so we'll just put a pin in Heretical Rise.
I put a pin on it in Google Maps.
Okay. Gonna rate it. Invisible Path Puzzle was bullshit, would not recommend.
Ouch.
So the Carians, that Ranni is a descendant of, as in Rennala and, that whole royal family.
Yeah.
They are descended from those people, but they're not actually the same. Interesting little fact about the Carian Manor, which is where Ranni's spirit sort of form is found. It's where she hangs out, like you said, with EG and Celavis and Blythe. There is an Evergaol that is called the Royal Grave. And it's the Royal Grave, and it's the Royal Grave that is near Caria. So presumably this is the grave of someone who was part of the Carian royal family, we can kind of assume. And in that is what is called an Alabaster Lord, or an Onyx Lord, because the game can't decide what they're called. Regardless, they are the same thing. They are described as being things that came from space. They came to the lands between and a meteorite. And they're the sort of masters of gravity magic, which is what Radahn ends up using. You can kind of see, okay, like, there's this lineage from, like, the Alabaster Lords through to Caria, through to Radahn. Radahn's whole gimmick is he's controlling the stars with gravity. Radahn himself has these sort of gravity-based powers. He's ripping things out of the ground. He's able to sort of use gravity to keep himself balanced on the tiny horse. So, like, there's this lineage that goes back there, and there's a lineage that goes back to the mountaintops, the astrologers, to this obsession with stars. The stars end up being very important to Caria, to Rhea Lucaria, to Lionia itself. So it's not like the astrologers just one day they moved down from the mountains to Lionia and became the Carians. It's a gradual process. They're distinctly different things. And in Heretical Rise, we kind of find out the point at which that started to happen. Because in Heretical Rise, we find a spell that is called the Founding Reign of Stars. And Founding Reign of Stars says, this is the eldest primeval sorcery discovered by an astrologer. But then it says that it became the founding of the glintstone sorcery. It says here that this astrologer basically looked to the skies and they saw what they call the primeval current. They saw these glimmering things in the sky. And that is sort of the point at which astrology diverged into what we now know as glintstone sorcery. And if you go inside of Heretic's Rise, you find all of these stones that presumably the heretic had, found in, I'm going to say her because I think I know who it was, her studies.
Who do you think it was?
Well, we'll get to that later on.
Was it the Snow Witch?
I think that was the Snow Witch's place, yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I think that is the witch. I think the witch lived there. But this is sort of what Ranni is reconnecting with. I mentioned before that, like, Rennala, there's a reference to Rennala encountering the moon, and that reference is made by someone who's in the mountaintops. It's kind of unclear, at least now to me, if that means Rennala herself went to the mountaintops. Or if it just means that because, like, the Erd Tree is one of the key sort of events in the story, is the Erd Tree kind of arrests the movement of the stars, and it arrests the sky. So astrology stops having the power that it used to have. Is that because in the mountaintops of the giants it's easier to see the moon? Like, I'm not actually clear if it means Rennala was there, or this is just you're seeing what Rennala saw, but this is one of the places you can actually see it properly.
And you said the Erd Tree messed with the stars.
It says that, yeah. Well, it says the age of the Erd Tree kind of stopped the movement of the stars. Or at least it clouded them, yeah.
So what you're saying makes sense. If the Erd Tree messed with the stars, and Ranni reconnected with her star heritage, it would explain why she doesn't necessarily like the Golden Order.
There's a lot of reasons she doesn't like the Golden Order, yeah.
There's a lot of reasons.
They stole her dad.
Oh.
But no, like, yeah, there's a lot of reasons. That's one of them.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned they stole her dad, and we touched on that in our Radagon and Marika podcast.
Yeah.
When do you think that happened? How old was Ranni?
How old was Ranni? Like, I don't know, she could be anywhere between 16 and 2000, I don't know. Because time is a mess in this game. Like,
so tell me more about time then.
So the time and like aging and people's ages, I think, is important to the Snow Witch discussion. Because the Snow Witch is described repeatedly as a crone, which implies like she's very, very old and presumably looked and sounded old, which is odd because the doll itself doesn't. The doll seems sort of weirdly like ageless, as it doesn't really have a particularly old face. But the implication is Ranni's tutor was very, very old. You're making a face.
You said tutor.
For a 5-hour analysis of Katekyo Hitman Reborn, click the link below, or go to patreon.com/SinclairLore for even more.
So yeah, if you are new, thanks for coming.
I think they clicked off as soon as the angelic outline appeared.
So the other thing about the Snow Witch is that, along with being implied to be very, very, very old, the items we get that relate to her, they're on what the doll is wearing. So presumably this is what the Snow Witch wore, because we find Ranni's body, she's dressed differently.
Yeah.
The Snow Witch is called heretical, which lines up very neatly with heretical rise. And it also says that Ranni met the Snow Witch in a forest. So there's two candidates there. One is, I think, like the obvious one. The other is a little weirder. So there is just straight up a forest in Caria Manor. It's out the back. There's a bunch of trees. Maybe forest is pushing it. It's more just like a bunch of trees that happen to be behind the Carian Manor, but nevertheless, she could have met them there. Like, Ranni has a rise that's near there. If Ranni's lived there most of her life, you can imagine her sort of playing in the forest. The other possibility that I find a bit more interesting is that there are no forests conventionally in mountaintops of the Giants, but there are those phantom trees. People will know what I'm talking about if they've been there. The mountaintops of the Giants are... The area looks like it's dead. The implication is that there was a combination of, like, there was a war, there was also some massive flame damage to the area, there was some huge fire, guess where it's from, that, like, decimated what vegetation there was there. So there's all these burned dead trees, but there's also these spectral trees that are not growing out of the ground, they're floating. It's like you're looking at the ghosts of trees, essentially, and you're looking at the ghosts of animals. Like, this used to be, at some point, this was quite a, like, verdant and populous area, and then when whatever it is happened, parentheses, Queen Marika made everything catch fire. That's what got rid of it, but it left these sort of echoes of what it used to be. And around Heretic's Rise, there's a whole lot of ghost trees. So that might also be the forest where Ranni met her mentor. Hi, Sophie here. There's a little bit of an awkward pause here because Sin isn't sure how to join two halves of this very, very on-topic conversation. So she's asked me to read you a fragment of a poem and ask if anyone can identify it. An angel without wings told me he had lost the map to go home. Powerless, I took a paintbrush and poured water onto dried paint. Is it Lionel Johnson? Is it Gershom Scholem? Or is it, more likely, the opening of an anime? Leave your responses below. It kind of helps the algorithm, but frankly, we've given up on that whole aspect. God. Back to the podcast. Radagon and Rennala explicitly, they meet on the field of battle. When Radagon is, it says he's at the front of a golden host, which is Queen Marika's army. So after Marika subdues everything, that's when they meet. They meet during, like, her campaign, I guess as she's coming down from sort of the Altus area to gradually take over more and more of the lands between. Radagon himself is descended from the giants in the mountain. They never explicitly say that, but they do say that Radagon is very, very embarrassed about having this very thick red hair that sort of marks you out as being a descendant of the giants. That itself is like a little interesting detail because you have the descendants of the giants and the descendants of the astrologers meeting again in Radagon and Rennala. So it's like everything sort of actually comes back.
comes full circle.
It comes full circle, and then it comes full circle again because Marika fucks it up again.
Aw, that Marika.
by stealing Radigan. And using him, in the long line of people she's using to further her own ends. The final thing I want to say about the Snow Witch is that when you encounter Ranni for the first time, she introduces herself as Renna.
Yes.
And you find in that area that's called the Three Sisters, there's the Three Towers. Presumably, they weren't always called what they're called now because one of them is called Celavis's Rise. And, Celavis is not one of the Three Sisters. I don't know exactly, if the Three Sisters may actually just refer, the towers are always called the Three Sisters and whoever's in them differs across time.
Okay.
There's Ranni's Rise and Renna's Rise, they're next to each other. So I wondered if, was Renna actually a real person at some point? I got to wondering, is Renna actually the name of the Snow Witch?
That would kind of fit.
It would make sense because it's an odd name to pick. It's really close to the name Ranni already.
Yeah, Renna, Ranni, Rennala.
Which leads to this idea of, hang on, is Renna just Rennala? If, this Snow Witch was, they say, a crone, a very old person, Rennala doesn't seem to be, a very old person. Even though this is weird fantasy stuff, she could be 2,000 years old, the point is, you would not describe Rennala as a crone. Even if you found out she was 5,000 years old, you wouldn't call her a crone. She looks like she's, 45. Which is a crone in anime years, but but I think the idea is Renna might actually be Rennala's ancestor. Renna was the heretic who lived in the mountains, and then over time was this line continues downwards, so you have Renna and then Rennala. In the same way you have Godfrey, Godwin, Godric, Godefroy, Morgott, yeah.
Thank you, Sophie. We know that Rennala is referred to as a queen of the full moon. And we also have our sorcery that tells us that the moon was encountered by young Ranni, led by the hand of her mother.
Yeah.
We have a whole bunch of moon and full moon references. We have dark moon items. And we also have an item that tells us that the Snow Witch taught young Ranni to fear the dark moon. So let me ask you a couple of questions. What is the moon?
What is the moon? Okay, well, there's at least two. So in the world of Elden Ring, from most places that are above ground, you can see a moon. It's quite large in the sky, and it's a pale white. Half of it's always obscured, it doesn't have moon phases, but anyway. And then, from one location, you can see two moons. And that location it doesn't actually have a specific name. It's a large sort of plateau region that you access at the end of Ranni's questline. From there, you can see there's a place they call the Moonfolk Ruins, and there's a place called the Cathedral of Manus Celis, which is interesting as a name because it means celestial hand. It's where Ranni's two fingers are found. And from that place, you can see two moons. The angle you'll likely see them from, you'll see one either side of the Erdtree. So you'll see the white moon, and then you'll see what it's calling the dark moon, which is, it looks the same as the light moon, but it's darker. If you just saw the dark moon on its own, you might not realize it was separate, because it's not that much darker.
Okay.
But you do see the two side by side, and it does go, oh, alright, that makes sense.
So the full moon is the lighter moon, and the dark moon is the darker moon.
Yes, and that's echoed in Rennala and Ranni themselves. Rennala, her signature spell, is a full moon. Ranni's signature spell is a dark moon. They function very similarly. You sort of turn yourself into a little moon and fly at the opponent. Well, they do. It looks silly, but it happens. They're very similar spells, but one is the full moon, one is the dark moon. Ranni's moon is described as sort of it's heavier and colder. A lot of Ranni's attacks have to do with frost, and Rennala's don't.
So when the crone taught young Ranni to fear the dark moon, the full line is, the snowy crone taught the young Ranni to fear the dark moon as she imparted her cold sorcery.
There's a lot of sort of lines in here that I find perplexing. There's a reference to the Golden Order was created when.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's saying that about something that must logically have happened after the Golden Order came into existence. So it became this question of like, well, by created, does it actually mean like the Golden Order was established or became what it is today rather than literally it was created? So when I see like fear the Dark Moon, it may just mean like respect the Dark Moon.
That's a very good point. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not 100% certain because her ending is to bring about this Age of the Stars. And like her own spell, her signature spell is the Dark Moon. Her signature weapon is the Dark Moon. If she's in fear of it, then she's in awe of it. She's not literally terrified of its existence. She's using it.
Mm-hmm. And that's a very good point because the created that you talked about is something I wonder as well. And what you're saying makes sense. Thank you, Sophie. I have one more question about the moons.
Okay.
Are there literal moons? And just to let you know, there's no right or wrong answer for this.
Oh, thank you. This is like the reflection exercise. After class today, I want you to reflect in your journal. There's no right or wrong answers about whether you think the moon is real. So the moons and cosmology in general is sort of hard to describe in physical terms a lot of the time in Elden Ring. A good example, I think, is the way in which you take the elevator down to Siofra, and you've gone underground, but underground there is a night sky that you should not be able to see if it's underground, which itself is further complicated by the fact they refer to that as a false night sky, implying it's not really the night sky. But there's also trees and animals down there that realistically should not be growing if there's no light. And that place there is also described as like it ushered in its own Age of the Stars. It had its own moon, despite being underground. Much like Dark Souls, it's actually completely unclear if this is even like a spherical planet or if it's just like a flat Earth somewhere, which is odd because it does a lot of things with space and gravity that implies like it's a very physical place, but at the same time the physical properties are extremely strange. We do know that like every representation of the moon that we see does show it as a sphere. Like the full moon sorceries, you become a spherical moon. We know that like there are meteorites, there are things from the sky that fall down. Stars fall out of the sky. You know, you can impact the ground and break through and find something underneath it. So like it has these physical properties, but like the more you think about it, the less sense it makes. By which I mean the less sense it makes like in a rational physical way. Another really good example is the Carian study hall, which you're able to literally turn upside down and climb up and come out the bottom of, but then when you come out the bottom of it, like the tower is still the right way up. Like all these very odd things happen with gravity and space in this game, to the point where gravity is its own school of magic. A lot of the backstory of it seems to involve things coming from the sky, and they're described as things like sort of that are outside of the lands between. They come from the sky, as if they're like it's like an alien invasion. They're actually falling down. But they're also described in ways that are very mystical, like the fate of the world is in the stars, and there's like astrologers who sort of study the stars and know what's happening. There's a very interesting moment in Celavis's questline where he is trying to betray Ranni. And in order to betray her, he needs what's called the Amber Starlight Shard. Starlight Shards are something you find throughout Elden Ring. You find them in those astrolabe things. And it just says, like, this is the residue of a star. Like, a star passed by and left this. And the Amber Starlight Shards are unique. You only get one. And you find it at the base of a statue of Malenia and Miquella. And when you show it to Celavis, he specifically says, oh, this was the fate of those demigods. So we know that, like, Malenia and Miquella, they were cursed by outer gods. Malenia's cursed by Scarlet Rot. Miquella, not 100% clear, might also be, like, something to do with the same deity, because they're twins. But nevertheless, like, their connection to this outer god that is, like, reaching through and like cursing them is sort of, it's made physical in this like literal lump of something that fell from the sky in front of a statue of them. It reminds me a bit of like the dream logic in Bloodborne. It's sort of metaphorical experiences and traumas and ideas attain physical form, and the sort of barrier between what's in your head and what's in the real world breaks down like a dream. That's kind of like the way in which it's depicting these sort of stellar and lunar things. The whole thing, it has a feel to it, which we've touched on a bit before, that like it's like a science fiction story as interpreted by someone who doesn't know anything about science fiction as a genre. We talked about Scarlet Rot. If you look at the way it behaves, you could talk about it as if it's like terraforming.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that the Erd Tree behaves is very like parasitic.
Mm-hmm.
It's like if these things had happened in a story that was like set kind of like contemporaneously or like near future, you would use that language. But it's those events kind of as filtered through a high fantasy story. So the characters in it, obviously the concepts of like terraforming and parasitism and like alien invasion don't exist to them. Like they can't conceptually grasp that. So it's described as like a disease that changes the land. Or like, you know, the Erd Tree grows and sprouts roots. They talk about things falling from the sky. So that whole way of engaging with the world, like it makes it very, very hard to tell sometimes how literally to take certain parts of it.
Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you, Sim.
So, Sophie?
Yeah.
Ranni seemed to have orchestrated the Night of the Black Knives.
Ranni was accused of orchestrating the Black Knife plot by herself.
Allegedly.
As alleged by Ranni herself, yes.
And that's the night where assassins murdered Godwin the Golden using a blade imbued it with the power of the stolen rune of death.
Okay, the stolen rune of death. People watching couldn't see your eyes then, but it was very impressive.
What?
You
Really?
were just like, your eyes by the rune of death.
Before asking my question, I'm going
Uh-huh.
to read the description of the curse mark of death. Curse mark carved into the discarded flesh of Ranni the Witch, also known as the half-wheel wound of the centipede. The curse mark was carved at the moment of death of the first demigod, and should have taken the shape of a circle. However, 2 demigods perished at the same time, breaking the curse mark into 2 half-wheels. Ranni was the first of the demigods whose flesh perished, while the Prince of Death perished in soul alone. So, Sophie.
Yeah.
Ranni stole the Rune of Death with the help of some assassins.
Yes. It's not clear if Ranni herself, like, threw a bone to distract Malekith and was then just like, yoink! Or if someone else was involved. Does that mean Ranni went to Farum Azula? It's very odd.
She could have hired a hitman.
A hitman?
What happens is they use this rune to create this blade that's the God Killer.
Well, I think we need to talk about who the assassins were, because that's important.
Well, there was Trish. Her name isn't really Trish. I just call her that. I don't know. I think it's cute.
Hi, we're the assassins. This is Trish. The assassins were from the Eternal Cities.
Mm-hmm.
They are Numen, which is a concept we've sort of brought up a couple of times.
Mm-hmm.
Marika herself was one of the Numen. Your player character can actually be a Numen too. It doesn't do anything. It's just one of the character sort of presets. You can be a Numen. And the Knights of the Black Knives, the assassins, were all Numen. And that's kind of significant because Ranni's plan involves a similar event that took place in the Eternal City, where the people of the Eternal City, the Numen, fought back against the Golden Order, and they did so with a special god-killing weapon. The leader of the Black Knife plot, Alecto, she is held in an Everjail that is actually on that plateau, where kind of Ranni is hiding her cool stuff she doesn't want people to find. So again, like, it's all very interconnected.
Mm-hmm. So why is this whole thing happening?
So the answer seems to be in that description you read out that mentions the way that the death worked, that it should have been a circle. Again, it's not really clear the mechanics of this, but this is how it works. That the death of the demigods, it should have been a single complete death. But because Ranni and Godwin died at the same time. They each only half died, so it was one death spread across two people. This ends up becoming important to the Golden Order, because the Golden Order is all about sort of totality and wholes and binaries, and it can't stand the idea of like someone being half dead. Nevertheless, Godwin essentially seems to have just been a sacrifice. Like, one of them had to die for this to work. So Godwin is described as dying in soul but not body. So the essence of Godwin, who Godwin was, Godwin's self, that dies, and it leaves behind a giant disfigured lump of flesh. And also weirdly doesn't seem to be able to die properly. The corpse is still there, it's still surrounded by flies. People sort of talked about Godwin as if he's still kind of alive. Godwin is technically still alive, but Godwin's soul is gone.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ranni is the opposite, where Rani's body has died. And you find her body, and it actually looks weirdly like the state you find Marika in. It looks like she's become stone. And she has the same wound that you see Godwin get in the intro, this sort of a half centipede brand on her back. So in having her body die, her soul lives on. That's why when you encounter her, she's incorporeal. She's a ghost that has to possess a doll to move around. That also makes her invincible.
Yeah. You can't kill her.
You can't kill her, and Celovus tries.
Good try, Celovus, but no.
Celovus is a bad man. Celovus opens up a whole new discussion about, like, the Carians and the astrologers and puppets. Because Caria is all about puppets, it's about marionettes, and Celovus is able to turn people into puppets.
So let me ask you with that in mind. Do you think he created the puppet for Ranni, the doll?
Well, it's weird because, like, Celovus seems to make puppets out of people. The thing about the Ranni doll is that there's the Ranni doll that she's possessing. And then there's the miniature dolls.
That's right.
So it's like there's more than one of these dolls. You have a tiny little pocket Ranni that lives within your pocket and talks to you.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, like, can't just be Celovus. Like, there's another guy called,
Gurman?
Yes, Gurman.
Mikolash? Because Mikolash also has puppets.
I wasn't even thinking of Paidia. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And his whole thing is he's also making puppets.
Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you, Sen.
And we can choose to serve Ranni. And if we agree to serve her, she asks us to find the hidden treasure of Nokron, the Eternal City. And the hidden treasure is the Finger Slayer blade.
Yeah.
Pretty self-explanatory. It's a blade that kills the fingers. And during our search for the blade, we actually have to kill Radon because he's stopping the stars in the sky, right?
Yeah.
And if you kill him, the stars start going, there's a meteor that falls and opens up a path for Ranni, essentially.
Yes.
Okay. And sometime after that, we find Ranni in front of a dead Two Fingers.
Yeah, I think you maybe skimmed over the fact that, like, the Eternal Cities specifically have a weapon that kills the Two Fingers just in it. The Eternal Cities are talked about as, like, a place that rebelled against the Golden Order.
Right.
Exact specifics aren't really clear. It describes them as, like, this act of blasphemy that upended the Golden Order. And it mentions that, like, the upending of the Golden Order is sort of what led to the city's downfall. And if you look at what did destroy the city, it's like Scarlet Rot. It's Estelle. And it's like it talks about there being a false knight. It's not that, like, they did something to the Golden Order and the Golden Order fought back and tried to, like, kill them. It's that in destroying the Golden Order, they basically seem to have created a power vacuum in which all these other things started to come in. Yeah, which sort of, raises the question of, like, hey, the Golden Order, it's like, it's a totalizing way of being. It's essentially like it's a colonial power that's taken over. But you can't just, like, upend it and expect everything to work out because it's so enmeshed in the way the world works that if you overthrow it, you just end up with this disorganized power vacuum into which comes Scarlet Rot and Estelle and everything like that. Ranni seems to want to avoid that.
Mm-hmm.
Ranni wants to usher in an age of the stars that is not a chaotic, rotted mess full of aliens, essentially.
Okay.
Yeah, and the other thing about, like, where we find the finger-slaying blade, is that it is underneath one of those giant corpse chair things. That we never find out what those are supposed to be. But what I think is significant is that they are all wearing gold. They all have a golden shawl on, which suggests that, like, they were vassals of the Golden Order. Because it says that that knife, like, it's called the Fingerslayer Blade, but it says that it harms the vassals of the Golden Order. We don't find evidence of any two fingers that are under the Eternal Cities, but we do find those big, they're called chair crypts.
So they could have been the vassals of the Golden Order.
I think those may have been the vassals, and that it says that it was born from a corpse, and I think that's probably the corpse. That was sort of their Godwin. Like, they killed one of them. They may have been the demigod equivalents. Murdered one of them, produced the finger-slaying blade, and that was the beginning of the end. And, like, by the place that you find the finger-slaying blade in one of them, there's all those mimic tears everywhere. And mimic tears, again, they're like, yes, it's a fantasy monster, it's a slime, but it's also the thing. It's like this weird sort of primal matter that came into the world and it could copy things. Again, being very much on that line of like, yeah, this is an RPG, it's going to have slime in it, but also the slime is described and behaves as if, like, you could imagine this in a science fiction story. That seems to have rained down upon the place where that was committed.
Thank you, Sophie. So at some point we find Ranni in front of the two fingers who are dead. I turned on my Inspector Sinclair senses.
Right.
I think Ranni may have killed the two fingers using the Fingerslayer Blade.
What makes you say that?
Gut feeling.
Look, what you need to understand is Elden Ring is a gift to From Software's true hardcore fans, and that is a red herring. I think we all know who really killed the two fingers.
Ludwig?
Think about it. You don't see Ludwig anywhere in the lands between. What is he hiding? Now, Sim, think about this, right? Ranni stole the Rune of Destined Death from Malekith, who reuses Ludwig's moveset and cutscene.
Oh my god!
It's like Into the Spider-Verse, and this is Ludwig has come in to the lands between.
Now, if anybody who's new made it that far, wondering, why Ludwig specifically? It's a long story.
It's not a long story. It's a very simple story, which is that when you played Bloodborne, you thought Ludwig killed Maria, and 7 years later you haven't stopped talking about it.
Thank you, Sophie. When we find Ranni, she's sort of in her slumber, and she mentions before that this doll body takes up a lot of energy and sometimes she needs to take a nap. And then this is where we can put a ring on her finger, and she materializes again. And she wakes up from her nap and she's like, "Aw, that's so cute." And we're like, "Thank you."
The other interesting thing about that is that Ranni talks about, like, specifically her two fingers. Like, she was given a specified two fingers for Ranni. So there's not one two fingers that you're just seeing in a bunch of places. They're all implied to be separate two-finger entities.
Yeah, and you're like, who do these fingers belong to?
Well, no, because all the Divine Towers, right?
Yeah.
The Divine Towers have on them, they have a dead two fingers with a rune.
Uh-huh.
And Ranni talks about being gifted things by the two fingers. So I think the idea is the two fingers are like maybe doling out the runes or powering up the runes or something. Ranni's tower doesn't have a two fingers on it. It's got Ranni's dead corpse. Ranni's two fingers is actually in Manasellus. So this is, I don't quite like, I understand what's happened, that she seems to have moved her two fingers to Manasellus and committed suicide on the tower. Or she commits suicide and then they swap the bodies. The thing is that you find Ranni doing that, killing the two fingers. The two fingers are buried. Like, it's a church called Manasellus, right, which we've established. Manus is hand, Cellus is celestial, so it's a church of the celestial hand. Pretty good description of the two fingers, celestial hand. The two fingers are buried under the church. It's not like they're enshrined in the church. They're not behind the altar. There's not even like it's in a basement. They're buried under there. And presumably at some point they were on that Divine Tower and they've been moved.
So when you say that, I have a vision of the two fingers just springing up on their fingers and walking.
Yeah, but the other thing, right, she doesn't kill them until then. So they were alive when she moved them.
Maybe they just got lost. They were looking for the bathroom and wandered off.
Why would they need to use a bathroom? They're just a pair of fingers. I mean, they're quite hairy. They might have needed to trim the knuckle hair. No, but like, I am actually wondering, was the idea behind that if you look at the two fingers, right, they're in contact with the greater will, but they're not literally the greater will. They're like picking up the greater will's sort of like thoughts, they're tuning into it, right? And they're relaying that. Goldmask does that. Goldmask tunes into the greater will. And he's there and he's got Corwin. And Corwin is saying, like, I am interpreting what Goldmask is thinking by the calculus of his fingers. So presumably Goldmask's fingers are moving very, very, very subtly. Essentially behaving like a finger reader.
Yeah.
Also, little note, Corwin doesn't entirely trust Goldmask. Like, he's willing to question him. Which also parallels the finger readers. It parallels, like, Enya. Presumably she's very old. She's dedicated her life, I'm assuming, to just reading the fingers. And then toward the end, she's like, this is taking too long and I don't trust those.
Yeah.
I think it's time we just, like, made our own decisions. So, the two fingers, right? They're almost like an antenna.
Like an antenna on an old TV. You gotta move it a little.
Yes, exactly. No, I'm not joking, though.
Okay.
If you think about that in terms of them, like, doling out great runes. If, like, the Elden Ring is part of the Golden Order, the idea that, like, the two fingers are sort of, like, tuning into it and giving you the great runes sort of makes sense. But, like, Ranni burying the two fingers underground might actually interfere with their ability to contact the Golden Order because they're cut off from it.
So they're not going to snitch on her.
Well, also part of it is she talks about them having kind of jurisdiction over her flesh. Like, they mark her flesh, they control her flesh, and her whole plan about, like, if my body dies but my soul endures, they no longer have control over her because her flesh is gone.
Yeah, and that's something we encounter as well with Blide. Because Blide was given to Ranni by the two fingers, right?
The fingers, yeah.
And we know if Ranni turns against the two fingers, Blide has this, like, Winter Soldier programming where he will turn on Ranni.
Yeah.
So, like, they do have some sort of a literal control over certain people.
Yeah.
You actually gave me a little vision when you said maybe they need to trim the hair on their fingers. And so it's basically the two fingers are like, I need a trim. Is there a barber here? And Ranni's wearing a mustache, holding the fingers like a blade. Like, I'm the barber. Follow me, sir. Let's go to the basement.
Hey, it's Hidetaka Miyazaki here, creator of Elden Ring, and I've been asked to explain what just happened. What just happened was that Sin experienced what we call a vision. It's a sudden flash of inspiration, and it's a perfectly normal part of the creative process. Visions that occurred during the creation of Elden Ring include: what if Albinaurics started life as frogs? What if we delete the entire Miquella quest and put him in an egg? And this vision, courtesy of George, which simply says, haven't played a game since Super Mario Bros. IDK Turtles. Of course, one of the problems with this collaborative approach is that not everybody is a team player. This note from Yui says, we have 4 times as many dungeons as we do boss fights. I'm worried it could get repetitive. Yui, do you remember the last game Tomohiro Shibuya worked on? No, neither do I. Back to the podcast.
Sophie, do the outro.
That was the Snack Covenant episode 294. It was kind of about Ranni, but Ranni is really complicated, so I'm sure we'll go back to her.
Excellent. Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you, Sen.
And thank you everyone for listening. And see y'all next time.
Bye.
Bye.